Hello, and thank you for joining us on our second episode of Fascism on Film. I'm James Kent. I am a writer and the arts editor at the Mountain Times in Vermont.
And I am Teal Minton. I am a screenwriter, fiction writer, and creative writing professor.
And so hopefully you've joining us from the first episode where we kind of kicked off what we're doing, and we're not going to spend another half hour of episode.
No, there are things that'll come up from our episodes that'll cross over, and we did sort of talk about the definitions of fascism in our first episode, so some of that will be referenced in our conversations going forward.
Yeah, and if you missed that episode, but you've somehow found us, certainly you can go to fascismonfilm.com, and that's where we're going to be housing all the episodes. And of course, you can follow us on Podbean or on Apple Podcasts and other avenues.
Spotify even.
Yep. So we'll be on all those places. Where we sort of ended in the first episode was kind of a starting point for people who may, again, we don't know what your film history is out there, listener. And we are here to give you some suggestions of where to start. And we talked about a movie like The Mortal Storm, which has got Jimmy Stewart in it, and so it's a movie that I didn't even hear about until a few years ago when we discovered it, and it's quite good. And the more I watched it, the better it gets.
Yeah, me too. And we'll be talking about that on the next episode.
Even though that kind of gives you like the kickoff of Nazi Germany and Hitler coming to power and how that changed things so fast, and sort of like how things can quickly change in a government over a span of only a few months.
Yeah.
And so that's why that might be interesting for people to seek out. But a great starting point, and I guess in terms of fascism, it's a little bit fascism light. And that's only because if you haven't seen very many movies about fascism and then you see this film, you might think, wow, that's a really great, powerful movie about the rise of Nazi Germany. And that is 1972's Cabaret, directed by Bob Fosse.
Starring Liza Minnelli.
And Joel Grey.
And Michael York.
Yes, and Marissa Berenson, right?
And Marissa Berenson, yeah. And a few other people whose names I can't remember. But
Helmet somebody.
One of the things that's great about this film is that it shows us the very, very beginnings of what it's like to live in a society when these forces start to just sort of bubble up a little bit in subtle ways. And it's almost possible to watch the first hour of this film without really thinking about the Nazis. They're there, they're mentioned, they're part of the background, but there isn't a confrontation with them. There's no Nazi villain. There's the hero does get beat up by Nazis at one point, but that's because he disrupts their protest.
Well, the cabaret owner, that's I think the first start of the violence is
the cabaret owner getting beat up.
Yeah, he takes exception to some Nazis, SAs that were visiting the cabaret, kicks them out. And so later the SA gets some of his brown shirt buddies, show back up, and the cabaret owner is beaten pretty bad.
Yes, while the show goes on. And this is really the first point in the movie where we see those opposite things, which is the club. We should talk about we should do a little what this movie is about. Give us a quick summary.
Cabaret is the kind of film that when we first came to it as youngsters, it was all about this musical with Liza Minnelli and this amazing performance. And I think that when I first was watching the film and enjoying it, it was because of the very dynamic musical sequences in the cabaret. And you would see Bob Fosse's brilliant screen direction, his composition, his choreography matched with editing in a way that was unique to the way films were. And so I first came to it seeing what a director does to shake up the musical medium, because musicals were always a certain way. And then it wasn't until I maybe was in my mid to late 20s and caught Turner Classic Movie screening on TV of Cabaret and watched it that the musical parts were still there. It takes place in a cabaret in the early 30s during the Weimar Republic
in Berlin.
And it's loosely based on a cabaret. There was a big cabaret nightclub scene, and there was a lot of debauchery there. And it was a time right before Hitler came into power where, for a brief moment in Berlin, if you were, say, a gay, or at the time, I mean, trans didn't really exist, but it did in these cabarets.
Yeah.
There was a lot going on where there was almost like this brief window of liberty and freedom amongst all this depression. But yet there was like an acceptance, at least within this major city. And then, of course, that it all got erased. And I bring up that parallel because one of the things that I see today in America, there was this brief window of maybe acceptance and a growing openness where maybe younger kids, especially if they were identified as trans or gay, lesbian, what have you, they felt a little bit comfortable that they could be who they wanted to be, and there was outlets that had never existed before, but then suddenly have faced a extreme resistance and rebuke from the right that is really amped up on taking away those liberties.
And that's a lot of what this film is talking about. I just want to say, before we get too far, it's about Sally Bowles, an American who's a singer in a cabaret in Berlin. Her British friend, Brian, who she has some sort of love affair with at some point over the course of the film. Their friend, who is hiding his Judaism and falls in love with a Jewish woman. Another friend of theirs who's a wealthy playboy who thinks that money can control Nazis. He's also an industrialist, yeah. But what you're talking about in terms of that period of freedom and liberalization is part of what freaked the Nazis out, and part of what they used propaganda to bring themselves to power with, is pointing out sort of this debauchery. And these cabarets were a symbol of it, to the point that they're specifically called out in Nazi propaganda. There's a film called Hans Westmar, which is a Nazi propaganda film. It's a dramatic film, not just a... and the main character is wanting to become a Nazi. He's starting to realize why the Nazis are right. And there's a scene in a cabaret that's very similar to what we see in the film Cabaret, and the guy basically has an anxiety attack and flips out because there's black people singing there, and they don't serve German beer and things like that. And so this the cabaret did hold a place in the imagination of Nazis as a symbol of everything that's wrong with our society that needs to be cleansed.
I mean, this film has a history. It's an adaptation of an adaptation of an adaptation.
Yes.
So it's based on a series of, it's either a book or a series of short stories, right? By
Christopher
Isherwood. And it was his experiences in Nazi Germany as it was becoming Nazi Germany from the Weimar Republic. And then it got turned into a play and a movie called I Am a Camera.
Yes.
I've seen the movie. It's
I have too.
It's not so great, but it's fascinating because it's essentially as much as you could in very code era movies. It's literally all of the stuff that's in Cabaret except for the musical numbers.
Yes, except for the musical numbers, and some of the sexuality is toned way down. It does have a different ending too, which I think is somewhat instructive, but
yeah, and Sally Bowles originally, the character was based on, was British, not American, but obviously for an American film, it was like, well, we could get Liza Minnelli. And
well, and I think also it's interesting having a Brit and an American sort of as expatriates in Berlin, because they're not totally threatened in the same way. It's not their society that's breaking down. They're outsiders. They're almost tourists. And she has a very weird sense of time. At one point, very early on in the film, he asks her, how long have you been in Berlin? And she says, oh, forever, 3 months. you realize that she's just she lives really in the present. She's not too concerned about what's happening in the future. She doesn't regret or muse over the past in any way. She's very in the present. And when you're in that sort of bubble, you're not necessarily thinking about what are these Nazis on the street doing? And, oh, they beat up this guy while I'm on stage. Well, don't even really know about it. So her sense of being in the present all the time is a form of ignorance in a way. And it makes us question, what would we do? The whole film sort of makes you question, do you just keep going on with your life, or do you stop and resist at some point if you even notice? And there's about almost exactly halfway through the film, Sally and Brian are hanging out with their rich friend. He's driving them around, taking them to parties. And they are driving through a street in Berlin, and they see some dead communist beat up on the sidewalk. And their friend says, the Nazis are just a bunch of idiot hooligans, but they can serve a purpose, which is they can get rid of the communist for us. And then we can control them. And Brian says, who do you mean by we? And he says, well, Germany, of course. And then it cuts to some shots of these bloodied bodies on the street. And while it's doing those shots, Sally is talking about how she can't wait for her new handbag. So there's this sense that there's this disconnect between the characters and the cabaret. And even though the cabaret does some satire and some parody of the Nazis, it's still sort of continuing on without really acknowledging the depth of the threat, because just to poke fun at Hitler isn't quite enough of an action to stop him.
The idea behind the musical Cabaret and then the movie and the musical sequences is that the cabaret, which of course is theater, it gives the opportunity for the movie, and we'll speak of it in terms of films, but it's an opportunity to comment on what's going on in Germany and through very clever ways in the songs.
Yeah.
And again, there's this slap dance routine that happens at the cabaret, which is edited back and forth with the cabaret owner being beat up by the brown shirts.
Yes.
There are more overt commentary to the behavior towards Jews, and that's in the that famous number with the monkey.
Which is also cross-cut with the Jewish woman's dog being killed.
Right. So what he's constantly doing is, in case you didn't get that this, Cabaret is commenting, Fosse will cut to real events and make it pretty clear. So like I said, sometimes I feel like it's maybe a bit over.
I think it is, but I also, in watching this film again, I realized it's almost possible to watch the film and think that the Nazi stuff is just background. For you, after seeing the film a bunch of times, it feels like you're being hit over the head. But I think on a first watch, it is possible to sort of get caught up in the character story. And the Nazi stuff sort of melts into the background a little bit. It becomes more and more present over the course of the film. But it doesn't really affect Sally. It doesn't really change her life in any meaningful way. And so it's possible to sort of go through the film in a little bit of that same state she's in, where you're not quite seeing the consequences. Of course, we have hindsight and we're looking back and, they walk out of the club early on in the movie, and there's a guy in like this tricycle bike riding by with a little swastika flag on, and they don't mention it, and it's not really mentioned. And then there's scenes where they're walking around the streets and you see Nazi or communist graffiti or propaganda posters in the background, and it's sort of the part of the fabric of their lives, but it's not dictating their lives.
And that is something that I do really enjoy about Cabaret. And again, I mentioned when it came together for me that first time that things were clicking in my late 20s watching it, it wasn't explaining what the propaganda posters were about. But like you said, it's part of the fabric. You're starting to see this become, and what it turns out, there was like different elections always going on in Germany.
Yes.
And the thing about the guy on the bicycle, this is a person who I think he's missing a leg or something, but he's clearly a World War I veteran.
Exactly.
And he has already subscribed to Nazism. And that's that idea of patriotism, because what a lot of the genesis of the Nazi Party is that we were winning World War I and we should not have given up, and that not only were forced to give up when we shouldn't have, but we lost so much, including our self-esteem in the process.
Yeah.
And so they were looking for, again, somebody to come back and rise them to glory. And that's, of course, how Hitler felt. He felt betrayed
absolutely.
by his government.
I'm not sure when the film ends in terms of the historical timeline, if Hitler has come to power at the end, because I'm thinking most of the film takes place in Robert Paxton's Stage 2, the rooting in political culture. Where it's attracting followers and things like that.
He has not come to power. It's on the eve. And where the film ends, where you see kind of that last shot and you kind of see like a distorted reflection of a brown shirt kind of in the audience. It's ending on the note of saying, this is now where the future and present is all coming together.
In this distorted funhouse mirror. And, the MC leaves the stage at the end after saying, come to the cabaret. There's no troubles here. Everything is beautiful here. It is this bubble where the outside world doesn't exist. Yet there's Nazis in the audience. And we know where this is headed. As viewers, we know where it's headed. And it's interesting to see characters who don't know where it's headed.
And also, I mean, one of the key moments is still, it's like, it does make your hair stand on end on your arms when you watch it. And it's just the brilliance of Bob Fosse's direction. And that, of course, is the beer garden scene.
All the other musical numbers take place in the cabaret, and it's dark. It feels like it's underground. It's always night there. It's smoke-filled. It's this kind of tucked away in this little cave, kind of. And all the musical numbers take place there, except this one you're talking about.
Yeah, and it's very Brechtian in that, Joel Grey, the way he's shot, he's always talking to you, the audience watching the movie.
Yes.
He's speaking to an audience outside the cabaret, but the way he's filmed, he's just talking to you.
Well, he looks straight into the camera and talks to the audience on several occasions.
Yeah, it's very unnerving. But then we have this scene again. It's where Sally and Brian and
Maximilian,
yeah. Fritz is the other guy, their friend.
Fritz is the other guy, yeah.
But Maximilian, and they've gone out to the countryside, and actually Sally has fallen asleep in the car.
Yeah.
And Maximilian goes to this beer garden with Brian. And so it starts where there's a flirtation. So Max has really been trying to seduce them both.
Yes.
This was probably pretty risky for a 1972 movie, but what seems like just an ordinary cafe, and you're getting lots of shots around, and so you're really seeing the theater.
It's this beautiful sunny day. People are sitting around out in the countryside enjoying a beer in this beautiful place. There's trees, there's wind blowing in the trees. Everyone seems to be just having a relaxing, chill afternoon.
But you also get the sense that these are like, I don't want to say they're farmers, or peasants, but you feel like these are workers, people of the land, not as educated.
They're not wearing a suit and tie.
Right. They're country folk.
Yeah.
And then there's a band playing, and then this kid steps up. You hear the voice, right, before you see what the kid is singing, and it sounds like a German folk song. And the first time I saw the movie, I thought it was a German folk song and didn't realize it was actually written by the people who wrote the music numbers for the movie.
Especially at the beginning of the song, where it's about sort of birds and trees and nature, and it feels very wholesome. And then the song turns into the chorus and the title of the song, which is Tomorrow Belongs to Me. And as he gets to that line, the camera pans down, and you see that this teenage boy who's singing the song is wearing a Nazi armband and is Hitler Youth.
I think people think there was just a day that suddenly Hitler was in power, but it was actually a 10-year quest to power. And movements, the Hitler Nazi movement, well, ironically, it had been growing, and it kind of hit a high point, and then it was on the way down again before he assumed power and convinced, to almost to quiet the Nazis down. And to get them, they thought, well, we can just appease the Nazis and let them fade away if we give in to Hitler's demands to make him the Reich chancellor.
As we have learned from history, fascists do not stop or negotiate. They just keep going.
Yeah.
So this song, the other thing that happens with it Tomorrow Belongs to Me, is that the audience gets to their feet. And all the people in this beer garden stand up and start singing along. And you see in this moment the allure of fascism, how it's like a microcosm of the German people being pulled into this and mesmerized by it. But it's not through hate, it's through beauty and glory and youth and a connection to nature. And that's a very dark thing that is portrayed in this very wholesome way in the film as a visual juxtaposition to what's going on in the cabaret.
And it also shows just how quickly Germany was shaping up in favor of that particular movement.
Yes. Exactly.
You see that, all these people, they were sitting there, you don't know what their political affiliations are, but as soon as this song hits its crescendo and everyone's standing, you realize that everybody there is looking for a glorious Germany. Again, how it gets there and who it hurts in the process, as long as it's not them.
They're not really concerned about that at this point. They haven't extrapolated into the future what this means. So another thing I want to talk about very quickly is fascist aesthetics, which is usually defined by triumph of the will. And I think if you say fascist aesthetics, people think of big, grand architecture, Nazi flags, giant Nazi flags, people Heil Hitlering in unison, people goose-stepping, those sorts of things. That very orderly, precise group behavior in a monumental setting is fascist aesthetics. And so there's a lot of question about what anti-fascist aesthetics look like. And what's going on in the cabaret is to some extent anti-fascist. It's a little more chaotic. There's gender fluidity, there's satire, and it's more fragmented. And having a more fragmented narrative or visual sense is, in some sense, anti-fascist. But the actual parody, Joel Grey puts a little mud on his lip to look like Hitler. They do the goose stepping routine. They do the if you could see her through my eyes routine. And they are sort of poking fun at the beast, but they're doing it in a way, and this is really the question, by having the dancers goose stepping on stage, are they actually reinforcing the fascist aesthetic as opposed to dismantling it? Part of what's interesting, you mentioned Fosse's choreography, is that his choreography is not what was going on in those clubs at the time. And so as a result, I feel like his choreography is more of a comment on fascism than would have been going on at the time. And maybe that's what you're talking about a little bit with getting hit over the head with it to some extent. But I feel like his choreography, the way he composes, the way he uses the lines of the bodies, is a comment on fascist aesthetics.
Now, to be clear, I love this movie. I've seen it many times, probably more than you have. And I know that, when we first started to go down this road a while ago, you were kind of dreading having to watch Cabaret. Yeah. Even though, like I said, I think that now that I've seen so many movies that I feel like kind of touch on themes, way better than this movie does. Yeah. It does feel like a little bit of a top layer approach, but it's a film that, like I said, when you're trying to get into these movies, it's a great place to start because it is very impactful. If you haven't seen all those other movies, it's really, really impactful. So it's a great place to maybe start the foundation and maybe not dive into, say, a film like Mephisto or The Last Metro
Well, it is one of these earlier stage of fascism films where you are seeing it rooting in the culture a little bit, and it feels background, and it's not taken that seriously. And I think that is actually very realistic. I think at the time in 1931 Berlin, a lot of people didn't take it that seriously. I'm going to read a quote here. This is from a scholar named Jennifer Davey. Irony, parody, and spectacle, while able to dramatize political conditions, are insufficient on their own as forms of resistance. They often merely reflect and reproduce fascist aesthetics rather than counter them effectively. So parody doesn't really resist so much as it reinforces. It's not really a strong form of resistance.
Well, I think that's what you were saying about the scenes in Cabaret when
Yes.
they are dressed up and doing the goose step, and they're making a comment and a parody of brown shirts. But again, there's so much that we can bite off, and that's why we're doing them in little chunks. And that really brings us to the end. Did we cover Cabaret enough? Maybe, maybe not.
I think, I think it's a really good movie for people to watch. I mean, it's a great movie just as a movie. But in terms of these very early stages of fascism, before it radicalizes, before it comes to power, and just the idea that these people aren't recognizing those signs, and that we as 20th century viewers, 21st century viewers, can look at it and go, oh my God, there's a swastika there. This is coming. And we know it's terrible. The MC knows it's terrible. But the characters are just sort of going on in their lives and not really being profoundly changed by seeing these symbols and this coming together of this movement.
Right. Because let's say in America, things go really sideways and, 20 years from now, people might be going, how did that all happen? And you realize it doesn't just happen in a moment. You're living through it, and not every day is terrible and not every day is impacting you directly, but one day it could.
And it just gets a little bit worse every day, just a tiny little bit, so that you don't, and there's lines in this movie where, like, the Marissa Berenson's character says, it's not a good time to be a Jew in Germany. Well, yeah, but she's not thinking about leaving.
No, and that's not very discussed in the film. And that's what's interesting, is that we're looking at that movie Cabaret 30 years after. And the question, and actually 40 years after the events that are supposed to take place. And so how much did Jewish people feel that the worst, even when they were like, the Nuremberg laws got passed and you started having all your freedoms taken away, it was very hard to imagine the end result, the end game at stake. You felt like, well, this is getting bad, but okay, it could be worse. And then as it got worse, well, it could even be even more worse. And eventually the worst came to pass.
And eventually it's too late.
And then as we end this episode, I will ask you a question to think about, I guess. You talked about these 5 stages of fascism.
Yeah.
Well, in the end stage, and in terms of the Holocaust, are there multiple stages there too? Because we have the final solution, but the final solution was not there to start.
The final solution is stage 5. That's radicalization.
Okay, but I'm just saying within that 5, where we get to it, right? Because there was already a lot of violence going on. People are disappearing, but like in the stages of what Germany did to the Jewish population in Europe, are there stages as well?
Yes, there absolutely are stages.
And I think that's something we'll need to cover.
There's smaller stages within these stages, right? Between stage 4, exercise of power, and stage 5, radicalization, there's hundreds of little tiny steps along the way where things get slowly worse and worse and worse until, oh my God, we're at the final solution.
We're covering a big topic, and we're not covering it in just 2 episodes or even 5 episodes. This is a podcast that's going to go on many episodes as we feel is necessary. And again, to get the episodes and stay in the loop, it'll be fascismonfilm.com, and, subscribe to Apple Podcasts or any of the places. Again, we know we'll be on Apple Podcasts to start. We know we're on Podbean, and we'll be working to get everything that we can, all the different channels. But we know when we're just starting up, these things take a little bit of time. So again, we're glad that you have found us, and hopefully you're finding this conversation interesting, and that you'll continue with us on the journey. Now, as we close, Teal, last words, what do we got coming up in the next episode?
Next, we have coming up The Mortal Storm, directed by Frank Borzage from 1940, and it's one of the first American films to really call out and examine what was going on with Nazism at the time, made before Germany started the war. So it's a very interesting film, almost a primer on fascism. It's like a checklist of a film for every element of fascism.
Yeah. And yet, even though it's a checklist, we are now, as we've living through something in extraordinary times, we're seeing how like on the money in a lot of ways that checklist is, and it's kind of
that checklist is highly accurate.
Yeah, and that's what I think. That's what lends new discoveries with some of these films. You come to them at different stages of your life, and you come to them at different stages of what's going on in the place that you live.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in the rest of the world. And yeah, there was a time in the 70s when some of these films like Cabaret were coming out when it seemed like this was a distant memory, something that still needed to be fought against. You know, the never again phrase really I believed in.
Yeah, and I think that there's something, and again, this is, look, the episode can be as long as we want, but I don't lose sight of the fact that the things that are happening now today in our country and in many other parts of the world as right-wing extremism is starting to take hold is that the voices, the people that either fought fascism of World War II or were caught up in it or were caught up in the Holocaust, the survivors, the majority of those people are no longer on this planet.
Yeah.
They have passed. And even their kids and other people that held a torch to say, we can't let these things happen again. And especially if you look in terms of America, they are gone. And that is where we start to get into the mistakes of history tend to repeat themselves.
And Cabaret shows us the very early signs of those tragedies.
Yeah. So again, lighthearted stuff, kids, and but stick with us if you find this interesting, because I think we find it interesting, and it's we're having. I'm enjoying the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Till next time.
All right. Goodbye.